You're watching News Feed. This is the PM edition. Thank you so much for staying with us. President Cyril Ramaphosa says his visit to the United States was positive. He met with US President Joe Biden and the two leaders discussed a range of issues. They agreed on the need to create a more attractive environment for African companies to invest in South Africa, American companies rather, to invest in South Africa. They also committed to the just energy transition and agreed that South Africa will require more funding for the transition to clean energy. President Ramaphosa also called for more US support in fighting the insurgency in Mozambique. And he has tabled a proposal for partnership with the US in supporting South Africa's efforts to develop public servants, especially women. With more on this, we are joined by international relations expert, Professor John Streamler. Professor, good afternoon. Thanks for speaking to us. Just give us an understanding from what you know of what transpired in those talks between the two presidents.
Well, we wouldn't get very much help from the very brief two-paragraph statement that was officially released, but I thought Cyril Ramaphosa gave a press conference with South African journalists that was very informative. I listened to that for over half an hour of question and answers, but also he showed his grasp of the complicated issues on a whole range of topics, which we can discuss if you wish. That gave me a hope for a reasonable partnership going forward, and the two leaders did meet with the press before they went into their closed-door session, and that also was very positive, with Joe Biden recalling his activism in the anti-apartheid movement, and Cyril Ramaphosa not mentioning that the U.S. was allied with the apartheid regime as part of the Cold War strategy for many years, but did the right thing at the ultimate choice. And after 4 years of Donald Trump, it's nice to see Americans and South Africans at that highest level at least talking to one another.
Well, it's clear from what you've just said that President Joe Biden does have a love for South Africa. Now, let's talk about security, health and climate. Those obviously would have been some issues that would have been tabled by the two presidents.
Yes, there were, and they were not discussed in great length, although President Ramaphosa did make it plain that he was concerned about the instability in Mozambique, which is nearby here. It was condemned, the malign Russian Activities Act that we can talk about, but in the case of Mozambique, the Wagner Group apparently is in there, and that would be a source of some concern to the Americans just because they're so brutal. But he also talked about getting the U.S. to lift sanctions against Zimbabwe, and I thought that was very interesting because in a sense he blamed the xenophobia on the forced migration that U.S. sanctions might have contributed to in the downturn of the Zimbabwean economy. It's a very complicated issue, but he was very deft in the way he navigated that issue on the world stage.
Well, interesting you bring that up, because in another conversation that I had only yesterday, ahead of the engagement by the two presidents, we did talk about President Cyril Ramaphosa's role as mediator, if you will, when speaking to the U.S. president, certainly on behalf of other African nations. Now, what are some of the other conversations around Africa that would have been had by the two presidents, and obviously their significance on their relations?
Well, it is really interesting to me, and I'm glad to hear this, that from President Ramaphosa, that South Africa feels a special priority and obligation to defend and advance collective African interests, whether it's the negative consequences. This was in the press release that the White House released, the negative consequences of the Ukraine war on the food situation and the hunger situation in Africa, and how they need to get progress toward peace settlements. The Cyril Ramaphosa did mention the Gutierrez role, the Secretary General's role in brokering for that kind of a peace, but he's been blown off, at least as we can, with the reports of the call to Putin of yesterday. But on other issues like energy transition and climate change, representation in the Security Council, representation in the G20 Cyril Ramaphosa made plain that he's an advocate for Pan-African representation, AU membership in the G20 and more seats on the Security Council that must be reformed. We all know that, and particularly in light of the Russian permanent vote and paralysis of the Security Council over the Ukraine crisis, it does need to be reformed. But when it will be, I don't know. But they did commit to work together and to advance the collective interests of Africa, even though the United States wanted this meeting with Cyril Ramaphosa to demonstrate that there is a particular interest in the democracy and the success of this country down here. So I thought that was to the good.
Now let's just go back to the issue of Zimbabwe. Obviously, is it significant on South Africa and its neighbours? And that Zidera Act, which was passed, I think, some 20 years ago, sanctions, targeted sanctions, it has been labelled, but obviously it has impacted millions of Zimbabweans, evidenced by the influx of many, for economic reasons, into South Africa and other neighbouring countries. What was the reaction of President Joe Biden to this, if you're aware, or is he likely to react?
Well, I think he may well take this on board, and I don't know how they discussed it in private, of course, and at the moment it was really President Ramaphosa who mentioned this in some detail in his press briefing, which I thought was significant because, after all, South Africa is the most seriously affected. The U.S. official position is that these are targeted sanctions and they're not really material to the misgovernance of Zimbabwe. But President Ramaphosa has a political hot potato on his hands domestically and in the SADC region. And so he's got to deftly handle this as best he can. And I think at least it's reassuring that the Americans are willing to talk to the South Africans on all of these issues.
Professor Streamler, appreciate your time this afternoon. Professor John Streamler, international relations expert, unpacking some of the issues in that conversation between the two presidents, President Cyril Ramaphosa and his counterpart, President Joe Biden.